The floating capital of the Althari Empire drifted above its violet world like a crown carved from light. Thousands of silver towers curved upward toward the stars, connected by transparent bridges where streams of air cars glided silently through the night sky. Inside those towers lived diplomats, generals, scientists, and nobles whose decisions shaped the fate of entire star systems. And somewhere in the middle of all that grandeur, Princess Vena was currently arguing with a hovering wardrobe drone. "No," she said firmly, pointing at the floating device. "That dress makes me look like a ceremonial curtain." The drone rotated politely, projecting three holographic alternatives. "Your Highness," it chimed, "this garment was selected by the Imperial Style Council to reflect dignity, grace, and planetary unity." "It reflects boredom," Vena replied. The drone paused for 2 seconds, which was the closest a machine could come to sighing. Standing a few steps behind her was a human man holding three data pads, a small metallic case, and a cup of steaming tea that he had been instructed not to spill under any circumstances. His name was Garrett, and he had been assigned to the princess less than an hour ago. So far, the job mostly involved standing quietly while fashion debates took place. Garrett had experienced artillery bombardments that were less intense than royal wardrobe discussions. Princess Vena finally turned away from the drone and noticed him again. "You," she said, pointing. Garrett waited. "You're the new attendant, right?" "Yes, Your Highness." "Good, hold this." She tossed him another data pad without warning. Garrett caught it smoothly, though the growing stack in his arms now resembled a small library. Vena studied him briefly. The human looked older than most of the palace guards, perhaps in his mid-30s, with dark hair and a short beard that suggested he did not spend much time worrying about fashion councils. His uniform was simple, almost plain compared to the polished armor worn by the elite security teams stationed throughout the palace. In Vena's mind, this confirmed her first assumption. Definitely a servant. "Follow me," she said, already walking toward the balcony. Garrett followed. The balcony overlooked one of the capital's enormous sky gardens, where floating platforms carried forests of glowing alien plants. Ships passed silently in the distance, while distant moons shimmered across the purple horizon. Vena leaned against the railing and stretched lazily. Her long, elegant ears, an unmistakable sign of Althari heritage, tilted slightly as she breathed in the cool, artificial breeze. "I hate council meetings," she announced. Garrett waited. "They last for hours. Everyone speaks politely while secretly trying to outmaneuver each other. It's like watching very slow chess played by people who think they're clever." Garrett considered that. "I once watched two warlords negotiate peace while both of them had hidden snipers aimed at each other," he said. She blinked. "Is that supposed to be comforting?" "Compared to that," Garrett said calmly, "political meetings are quite relaxing." Vena laughed, assuming he was exaggerating. "You humans have strange humor." "I've been told that before." She turned to look at him again, slightly curious now. "What did you do before becoming my attendant?" Garrett thought about the question for a moment. "I solved complicated problems." She nodded slowly. "So, paperwork." "Something like that." Vena smiled in satisfaction, believing she had accurately summarized his life. For a while they stood quietly while the sky traffic drifted past the gardens below. Palace guards moved along distant corridors, and a formation of sleek patrol drones crossed the horizon like silent birds. Eventually, Vena spoke again. "Carry my tea." "You're already holding it, Your Highness." "Oh." She looked at the cup in her hand, frowned, and handed it to him anyway. "Carry it better." Garrett accepted the cup. Years ago, he had once coordinated the evacuation of a colony while orbital bombardment collapsed half the city around him. Now he was holding royal tea. Life was unpredictable. Behind them, two palace security officers stepped onto the balcony and froze when they recognized Garrett. Their eyes widened briefly before they quickly composed themselves. One of them whispered to the other, "Is that?" "Yes." "Why is he carrying tea?" Neither of them had an answer. Vena noticed the guards staring and rolled her eyes. "Relax," she called to them. "He's just my new attendant." The guards exchanged another look. Garrett said nothing. The princess turned back toward the glowing sky, completely unaware that the quiet human carrying her tea had once commanded fleets, ended wars, and reshaped the history of entire star systems. For now, he simply stood beside her and waited. Morning light from the artificial suns of the orbital capital spilled through the towering glass arches of the palace gardens, painting long silver reflections across the marble walkways. The Althari Empire liked its sunlight carefully calibrated, warm enough to feel natural, bright enough to make the architecture look expensive. Princess Vena walked through the garden with the confidence of someone who had grown up believing the universe had been designed specifically for her convenience. Her long ears tilted slightly forward as she admired a cluster of floating blue flowers drifting lazily above a crystal pond. Behind her, Garrett followed with the calm patience of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with royalty was rarely productive. He was carrying 6 data pads. And the tea again. "Why are you walking so slowly?" Vena asked suddenly. "I am walking at the exact same speed as you, Your Highness." "Well, walk faster." "If I walk faster, I will pass you." She stopped and considered that. "Yes," she admitted after a moment. "That would be inconvenient." They continued walking. 2 small maintenance drones buzzed overhead, trimming the floating vines that decorated the garden arches. One of them paused above Garrett's head and scanned him briefly before continuing its work. Vena glanced over her shoulder. "You're very quiet." "I'm standing." "That is not a personality." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "I will work on becoming more interesting." "Good." They reached a wide circular platform overlooking the lower districts of the orbital city. Far below them, thousands of air cars moved between towers, while massive transport vessels glided toward distant docking rings. The Empire stretched across half the visible galaxy, yet at this moment the princess appeared most concerned with the temperature of her tea. "It's colder than before," she said suspiciously. Garrett checked the cup. "It has been 20 minutes. "So? Time tends to do that." Vena sighed dramatically and leaned against the railing. "You humans are very strange." Garrett looked out across the sky traffic. "I've also been told that before." She watched the city in silence for a moment before speaking again. "What exactly does an attendant do all day?" "Mostly stand behind important people and pretend their problems are extremely interesting." She smirked. "You're learning quickly." A pair of palace guards approached along the walkway. The moment they noticed Garrett, both men straightened instantly and gave him a precise military salute. Garrett nodded politely. Vena frowned. "Why did they salute you?" Garrett shrugged slightly. "Humans are polite." "They didn't salute me." "You outrank them. It would be unnecessary." She considered that explanation. It seemed logical enough. The guards continued walking, though one of them glanced back at Garrett with the expression of someone trying very hard not to laugh. Vena missed it completely. Instead, she pointed toward a tall tower in the distance. "That's the diplomatic wing. I'm supposed to attend 3 meetings there today." Garrett nodded. "How tragic." "Exactly." They began walking again along the curved garden path. After several minutes, Vena suddenly asked, "Have you ever been in space combat?" Garrett blinked once. "A few times." "Really?" "Yes." "What was it like?" Garrett thought about the question carefully. "Well," he said, "there are usually a lot of alarms." "That sounds stressful." "Sometimes people try to shoot you." "How rude." "I thought so too." Vena laughed. "You're making that up." Garrett did not answer. A breeze moved through the garden as a massive patrol cruiser drifted across the sky above the palace. Its shadow briefly passed over them before the ship vanished into the clouds. Vena watched it disappear. "I've never actually been in a battle," she admitted. "Everything I know about war comes from council briefings and historical documentaries." Garrett nodded. "Those usually leave out the unpleasant parts." "Such as?" "Running out of coffee." She stared at him. "That can't be the worst thing." Garrett took a sip of her tea. "You'd be surprised." They reached the far side of the garden, where a wide corridor led deeper into the palace complex. Security fields shimmered faintly across the entrances, while surveillance drones hovered quietly near the ceiling. Vena stopped walking. "You know," she said slowly, "you're a very unusual servant." Garrett waited. "You talk like a soldier." Do I? Yes, and you stand like one. I'll try to slouch more. That would help. She started walking again. Behind them, two more palace guards appeared at the entrance of the garden. Both immediately froze when they saw Garrett. One of them whispered under his breath, "Why is he carrying tea?" The other guard shook his head slowly. "I have absolutely no idea." Ahead of them, Princess Vena continued toward the diplomatic tower, completely unaware that the quiet man following her had once commanded entire fleets through battles that reshaped the fate of star systems. At the moment, however, his primary responsibility remained clear. Carry the tea, and try not to spill it. The outer market ring of the orbital capital was louder than the palace by several thousand decibels and several million opinions. Princess Vena loved it immediately. Colorful market platforms floated along the inside curve of the massive station ring, each one crowded with merchants from distant systems. Alien traders displayed strange technology, glowing plants, singing crystals, and at least one object that might have been a chair, but looked suspiciously like a sleeping animal. Vena moved through the crowd with bright curiosity. Garrett followed 3 steps behind, holding 2 shopping bags, 3 data pads, and the tea. The tea had survived the shuttle ride, so far. "You see," Vena said proudly while gesturing toward the endless market lanes, "this is why I insisted on coming here." Garrett glanced around. "I suspect it is because the Palace Security Council specifically advised you not to." She smiled. "Exactly." A merchant with 6 arms enthusiastically waved them toward a table filled with glowing glass spheres. "Princess, Princess, genuine gravity pearls from the Jurnath Nebula." Vena leaned forward. "They glow." "They also float," the merchant added proudly. He tapped one of the spheres. It immediately lifted from the table and began drifting lazily around the stall. Vena gasped with delight. Garrett watched the floating pearl. "I believe the palace already has gravity." "Yes, but this one glows." "That is a strong argument." She bought 2. Garrett added them to the growing collection of items he was carrying. A few steps later, she stopped at a stall selling fruit that shimmered with shifting colors. "What are those?" she asked. The vendor smiled proudly. "Lumina berries, Your Highness. They sing when you bite them." "They sing?" "Yes." She bought a box. Garrett did not ask questions. As they walked deeper into the market, Vena continued talking enthusiastically, while Garrett quietly observed everything around them. His eyes moved constantly, rooftops, balconies, reflections in glass panels, the subtle movements of the crowd. Vena noticed none of it. "This place is wonderful," she said, while examining one of the glowing fruits. "No council meetings, no speeches, just people doing normal things." Garrett nodded. "Yes, very peaceful." At that exact moment, 3 security drones flew overhead with their scanning lights flashing. Vena ignored them. She suddenly turned toward Garrett. "You know, you're doing surprisingly well as an attendant." "Thank you. You carry things without complaining." "I've had practice." "With shopping?" "With difficult situations." She laughed. "Carrying fruit is not a difficult situation." Garrett tilted his head slightly. "That depends on the fruit." They passed a group of armored traders arguing loudly about starship fuel prices. Nearby, a robotic musician played a strange instrument that sounded like a flute arguing with a violin. Vena sampled one of the Lumina berries. The fruit immediately produced a cheerful musical tone. She blinked. "Oh." The berry sang again. Garrett looked impressed. "That seems inconvenient during stealth missions." "I am not planning any stealth missions." The berry continued singing. A few meters away, high above the market walkway, a thin shadow moved across the metal support beams. Garrett noticed. He stopped walking. Vena continued forward for 2 steps before realizing he was no longer behind her. "Why did you stop?" she asked. Garrett did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked up toward the upper maintenance rails far above the market. To most people, the metal structures looked empty. To Garrett, they did not. "Your Highness," he said calmly. "Yes?" "Please stand slightly to the left." "Why?" "Because someone is about to shoot you." She stared at him. "That is not funny." Garrett grabbed her shoulder and pulled her down behind a cargo table. A brilliant flash of energy tore through the air, exactly where her head had been a second earlier. The market exploded into chaos. People screamed and scattered as another shot slammed into a nearby stall, sending fragments of metal and fruit flying across the platform. Vena stared at Garrett in shock. "What just... assassin?" Garrett said calmly. He reached down and picked up a fallen security rifle from a stunned guard. Another shot fired from above. Garrett leaned around the table, aimed once, and fired. A distant metal beam sparked violently. High above them, a hidden figure lost balance and collapsed onto the maintenance rail. Garrett stepped out from cover. "3 attackers," he said quietly. "2 still moving." He pointed toward 2 distant corridors. "Guards, block those exits." The security officers obeyed instantly. They didn't even question it. Vena blinked. "Why are they listening to you?" Garrett was already moving through the market with calm precision, directing guards, predicting movements, and positioning drones before the attackers could escape. Within minutes, the chaos slowed. 2 assassins were captured. The sniper above the market had been disarmed. Silence slowly returned to the platform. Vena stood behind the cargo table, still holding the box of singing fruit. One of the senior palace commanders rushed toward them, breathing heavily. The moment he saw Garrett, he immediately stood straight and gave a perfect military salute. "General Garrett," he said, "the attackers are secured." Vena blinked. She looked at Garrett, then at the commander, then back at Garrett. "General," she said slowly. Garrett sighed. "Well," he said calmly, "this is awkward." The shuttle ride back to the palace was unusually quiet. Princess Vena sat across from Garrett, her arms crossed tightly, her long ears tilted slightly backward in the way they always did when she was deeply annoyed or deeply embarrassed. At the moment, she was both. Garrett sat calmly in the opposite seat, holding the same shopping bags from the market. The Lumina berries were still singing softly inside their container. Every few seconds, the fruit produced a cheerful little melody. It felt inappropriate. Vena stared at Garrett as if she had discovered that her wardrobe drone was secretly the emperor of another galaxy. "You," she said slowly. "Yes, Your Highness. You are not a servant. That is correct. You are not an attendant. That is also correct." She pointed toward him accusingly. "You are a general." "Retired," Garrett said gently. "That is not the point." She leaned forward. "You let me order you to carry fruit." Garrett looked down at the glowing container in his hand. "They sing." "That is also not the point." The shuttle pilot in the front compartment tried very hard not to laugh. Vena rubbed her forehead. "Why did nobody tell me who you were?" Garrett thought about that question for a moment. "The High Council assumed you would notice." She stared at him. "You carried my data pads." "Yes." "You carried my tea." "Yes." "You held my umbrella." "It was an excellent umbrella." Her ears twitched with frustration. "I asked if you knew how to polish ceremonial boots." Garrett nodded politely. "I do." "That was not a test." "I suspected that." She fell back into her seat with a dramatic sigh. Outside the shuttle window, the massive towers of the orbital capital slowly drifted closer as they approached the royal docking ring. Patrol cruisers hovered near the station perimeter, while defensive satellites glimmered like distant stars. Vena suddenly leaned forward again. 3 wars, she said. Garrett blinked once. "Yes. You won 3 wars. I had help." "That is not what the commander said." Garrett shrugged slightly. "Commanders tend to exaggerate. You dismantled an assassination team in 5 minutes. They were poorly organized. They almost shot me." "That part was unfortunate." She stared at him in disbelief. "You talk about this like it was a minor inconvenience." Garrett thought about that. "I once spent 2 days negotiating a ceasefire while both sides were actively bombing the city we were standing in." She opened her mouth, then closed it again. "That seems complicated." It was a long meeting. The shuttle landed with a soft vibration as docking clamps locked onto the hull. The rear door opened. Several palace security officers were waiting on the platform. The moment they saw Garrett, they all straightened immediately. Vena noticed this time. Every single one of them saluted. She looked slowly at Garrett. "You are definitely not a servant." Garrett stood and picked up the shopping bags. "I tried to tell you." "You did not try very hard." That is fair. They stepped out onto the docking platform together. The palace corridors were already buzzing with activity. News of the assassination attempt had clearly spread faster than the shuttle. Officers hurried through the halls, while surveillance drones drifted silently along the ceilings. As they walked, Vena kept glancing sideways at Garrett. You could have told me. You did not ask the right questions. I asked what your previous job was. I said I solved complicated problems. You made it sound like paperwork. Garrett smiled faintly. Strategic paperwork. They reached the central elevator that led to the upper palace levels. The doors opened with a soft chime. Inside the elevator chamber stood two members of the High Council. Both of them looked extremely serious. Vena pointed immediately at Garrett. Did you know he was a general? Yes, one council member said calmly. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because, the other council member replied, we wanted to see how you would treat someone you believed had no status. Vena blinked. That is an incredibly unfair experiment. Perhaps. The elevator began rising toward the upper palace levels. Silence filled the chamber for a moment. Then the council member spoke again. There will be more attempts on your life, Princess. Vena's ears lowered slightly. We know. You require proper protection. She crossed her arms. I already had protection. Yes, the council member said. He nodded toward Garrett. And now you also have a teacher. Vena slowly turned her head. Garrett stood quietly beside the elevator wall, still holding the shopping bags and the singing fruit. Oh no, she said. Garrett smiled faintly. Oh yes. The next morning began with alarms. Not the gentle palace alarms that reminded nobles about breakfast appointments and ceremonial briefings. These alarms were louder, sharper, and very clearly designed to make people move quickly. Princess Vena sat upright in bed with her hair in complete chaos. What is happening? She demanded. The answer arrived through the open balcony door. Garrett stood there calmly. Training. Vena blinked at him. It is sunrise. Yes. I do not attend wars at sunrise. That is unfortunate, Garrett said. Wars often attend you. She dropped back onto the bed. No. Yes. No. Yes. She pulled a pillow over her head. Garrett walked over to the window controls and tapped a small panel. The room instantly filled with bright artificial sunlight. Vena groaned. You are a terrible person. I've been called worse. 20 minutes later, she stood inside the palace training arena, wearing a lightweight combat suit that clearly belonged to someone who did not appreciate royal complaints. The arena itself was enormous. A circular chamber filled with holographic projectors, drone launch ports, and movable terrain panels. Entire battlefields could be simulated inside the room. Vena crossed her arms. I am a diplomat, Garrett nodded. And today you are a moving target. That is not encouraging. He pressed a small control on his wrist. The arena lights dimmed. Dozens of small training drones dropped from the ceiling. Vena looked up. Oh no. Oh yes. The drones activated. Red scanning beams swept across the arena. Garrett stepped calmly to the side. Rule 1, he said. Assassins prefer stationary targets. One of the drones fired a harmless stun pulse that exploded against the floor next to Vena's feet. She jumped 3 meters backward. That was not harmless. You are not unconscious. That was luck. That was slow reflexes. Another pulse fired. Vena sprinted across the arena and dove behind a moving wall panel. Garrett checked his wrist display. Better. Better? I almost died. You were stunned. That is not comforting. Another drone descended toward her hiding spot. Vena grabbed a training rifle from the equipment rack and fired wildly. The drone exploded in a burst of harmless sparks. She stared at the smoking remains. I got one, Garrett nodded. Excellent. Only 27 left. Her ears dropped. You are joking. He did not answer. The drones attacked again. For the next 30 minutes, the princess ran, jumped, rolled, and complained her way across the arena, while Garrett calmly observed like a very patient instructor watching a student discover gravity for the first time. Eventually, the drones powered down. Vena collapsed onto the floor. I hate you. That is normal. I am reporting you to the council. They assigned me. I am reporting the council. Garrett offered her a hand and helped her stand. You survived. That was the goal? That was lesson 1. She brushed dust from her suit. What is lesson 2? Garrett walked toward the arena exit. Awareness. They stepped into a wide corridor where palace guards moved quietly along the walls. Garrett suddenly pointed toward the ceiling. How many security drones? Vena looked up. 3. There are 5. She squinted. Oh. He pointed toward a nearby corridor. How many exits? 2. 4. She sighed. You are very annoying. Garrett nodded thoughtfully. It has been mentioned. They continued walking. A group of younger palace guards passed them and immediately straightened when they saw Garrett. One of them nearly saluted before catching himself. Vena noticed. You see that? She said. Yes. They almost saluted you again. Yes. Why? Garrett thought about that. Humans are polite. She stared at him. That explanation is not improving with time. They reached the palace balcony overlooking the orbital city. Vena leaned against the railing, breathing heavily from training. Ships drifted silently across the sky, while distant transport lanes glowed like rivers of light. Garrett stood beside her. You improved today. That is because I was trying not to die. That is an excellent motivation. She looked at him. You really expect me to become some kind of warrior princess, don't you? Garrett shook his head. No. She blinked. Then what is the point of all this? He looked out toward the stars for a moment. The point, he said quietly, is making sure that the next time someone tries to kill you, they regret it. Vena slowly smiled. That does sound satisfying. Garrett nodded. Yes, he said. It usually is. Several weeks later, the palace had quietly accepted a strange new routine. Princess Vena ran through the corridors at sunrise. Not gracefully, not elegantly, but she ran. Palace staff had grown used to seeing the future ruler of the Elthari Empire sprint past them wearing training armor while muttering things about annoying human instructors. Behind her, Garrett walked at a relaxed pace. He never seemed out of breath. Vena finally stopped near the observation balcony overlooking the city and leaned against the railing, breathing hard. You walk too calmly, she said. Garrett looked at the sky traffic drifting between the towers. I have longer legs. That is not fair. War rarely is. She glared at him. You bring war into every conversation. It tends to follow me. The morning sky glowed violet above the planet below them. Massive orbital shipyards floated in the distance, while cargo freighters crawled through the traffic lanes like slow-moving metal whales. Vena followed Garrett's gaze. You spent a lot of time out there, didn't you? Yes. Fighting. Yes. She tilted her head slightly, her long ears shifting with curiosity. Were you afraid? Garrett thought about the question longer than usual. Sometimes. She seemed surprised. You don't look like someone who gets afraid. That is because panic is very bad for planning. Vena laughed quietly. That is the most boring, heroic statement I've ever heard. It works surprisingly well. They stood there for a moment before a small, hovering drone approached Garrett. A blue light blinked on its side. Garrett extended his wrist and allowed the drone to transmit data to his wrist display. His expression changed slightly. Vena noticed. That look means something unpleasant. Probably. He turned the display toward her. Several lines of tactical analysis scrolled across the screen. Security breach simulations, power grid disruptions, entry vectors. Vena frowned. That looks complicated. It is an attack plan. Her ears lowered immediately. Another assassination attempt? Garrett shook his head slowly. No. What then? A palace takeover. She blinked. That sounds worse. It usually is. Garrett expanded the display. Several red markers appeared across the palace structure. Multiple infiltration teams. Coordinated timing. They are planning to strike several government targets simultaneously. Vena studied the map carefully. Why not just kill me? Because chaos is more useful than murder. She leaned closer to the display. That entry point doesn't make sense, she said suddenly. Garrett looked at her. She pointed to a ventilation shaft marker. They would trigger the internal scanners if they came through there. Garrett tilted his head slightly. You're right. She traced another route across the map. They would use the maintenance ring instead. It bypasses two of the security layers. Garrett stared at her for a moment. You've been paying attention. She smiled proudly. I occasionally do that. He zoomed the map toward the maintenance ring. Then where would they strike first? Vena thought carefully. Her eyes moved across the palace layout. The communication hub, she said finally. Why? Because if the palace can't coordinate its defense, the rest of the attack becomes easier. Garrett nodded slowly. That is exactly what I would do. She crossed her arms. I am learning from the best. That is a dangerous sentence. They continued studying the tactical map. A palace security officer suddenly rushed onto the balcony. General Garrett. Garrett looked up. What is it? We just intercepted encrypted transmissions from the outer maintenance ring. Garrett showed him the display. Confirm if these entry points are compromised. The officer scanned the map. His eyes widened. These are exactly the coordinates we detected. Vena blinked. Oh, Garrett looked at her. You predicted the attack path. She straightened proudly. I am an excellent student. The officer stared at her in disbelief. Garrett smiled slightly. Prepare defensive teams, he told the officer. Quietly, no alarms yet. Yes, General. The officer hurried away. Vena looked back at the city skyline. So, she said casually, how many attackers do you think there are? Garrett checked the data again. Probably 30. She nodded slowly. That sounds unpleasant. Very. She turned toward him. Well, she said, stretching her shoulders, I suppose this is where my training becomes useful. Garrett raised an eyebrow. You intend to participate? She smiled. You said I should make assassins regret their decisions. That advice still stands. Good. She walked toward the palace interior. Garrett followed. Security drones were already beginning to move through the corridors as quiet preparations started throughout the palace. Vena glanced back at Garrett with a confident grin. You know, she said, a month ago I thought you were a tea-carrying servant. Garrett nodded. And now? Now I'm slightly worried you enjoy this kind of situation. He thought about that. A little, she laughed. That is extremely concerning. The palace lights dimmed across several corridors as security protocols quietly shifted into defensive mode. Surveillance drones drifted silently through the halls like metallic ghosts, scanning every doorway and ventilation shaft. Princess Vena stood in the central command gallery overlooking the palace interior. Below her, guards moved quickly but calmly, taking positions exactly where Garrett had instructed. Weeks ago, she would have found the situation terrifying. Now she found it strangely exciting. Garrett stood beside the tactical display, studying the security feeds. Multiple blinking red markers crept slowly across the palace map. They're inside, he said calmly. Vena leaned closer to the display. How many? 27. That's oddly specific. 3 changed their minds when they saw the outer defense grid. That seems reasonable. The first alarm sounded 2 floors below them. A group of infiltrators burst through a maintenance corridor, only to be met by a squad of palace guards who had been waiting for exactly that moment. Energy bolts flashed through the hallway. 2 attackers dropped their weapons immediately. One attempted to run. A stunned drone politely corrected that decision. Vena watched the feed with focused attention. That went well, Garrett nodded. They underestimated palace security. They also underestimated you. That happens often. A second alarm triggered on the eastern wing. Garrett tapped the console. Team 2, hold position, he said calmly into the comms. They'll attempt to bypass you through the upper gallery. The guards adjusted their formation immediately. 30 seconds later, the infiltrators walked directly into their defensive line. Vena smiled. That was satisfying. Garrett folded his arms. War is mostly preparation. I'm starting to see that. Another security officer rushed into the command gallery. General, 2 hostiles are approaching the communications hub. Garrett didn't even look at the display. Princess? Vena stepped forward. They'll split at corridor intersection C14, she said instantly. One goes for the uplink, the other disables the internal network. Garrett nodded to the officer. You heard her. The officer ran off. Vena watched the map closely. Moments later, the security feed confirmed her prediction exactly. The attackers separated at the corridor intersection and were quickly surrounded by waiting guards. Garrett glanced at her. "You're getting good at this," she smiled. "Try not to sound surprised." Within minutes, the last red marker disappeared from the tactical map. The palace fell quiet again. Vena leaned back against the console. "That's it? That's it. 27 attackers defeated." "Yes." She crossed her arms proudly. "And none of them got anywhere near me." Garrett nodded. "That was the plan." They walked out onto the observation balcony overlooking the orbital city. Night had fallen across the planet below, and the stars stretched endlessly beyond the station's shields. Traffic lanes glowed across the darkness, while patrol cruisers moved slowly along the horizon. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Vena said quietly, "I used to think the universe revolved around me." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "That is a common royal condition. I thought being a princess meant people existed to serve me." Garrett nodded thoughtfully. "And now?" She looked out at the stars. "Now I think it means people are trusting me not to ruin everything." Garrett smiled faintly. "That is a healthier interpretation." She glanced sideways at him. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" "Knew what?" "That I would change." Garrett considered the question. "I suspected you might. And if I hadn't," he shrugged, "then I would have had a much more difficult job." She laughed softly. "You're a strange teacher." "I'm a retired soldier." "That does explain a lot." Far below them, the palace lights reflected across the curved surface of the orbital station. Ships moved slowly through the silent dark, while distant stars burned quietly in the endless void. Vena rested her arms on the railing. "You know something funny?" "What?" "A month ago, I thought you were a servant assigned to carry my tea." Garrett nodded. "It was good tea." "You saved my life." "Yes." "You trained me." "Yes." "And you let me embarrass myself for 2 weeks." Garrett looked slightly amused. "That part was educational." She shook her head with a smile. "I suppose I deserved it." Garrett leaned against the railing beside her. "You learned faster than most commanders I've trained." She blinked. "You trained commanders?" "A few." "Did they also complain this much?" "Constantly." She laughed again. For a moment, the two of them simply watched the stars. Then Vena straightened slightly, her long ears lifting with quiet confidence. "You know," she said, "if anyone tries to attack this palace again—" Garrett glanced at her. "Yes? I think they're going to regret it." Garrett smiled. "That," he said calmly, "was the entire idea."